What I've hoped for others to learn as they observe my leadership is to be anchored in the purpose and to be focused on the mission. The purpose and the mission are two different things. They are not the same. The purpose answers the why question, and the mission answers the what question. To be focused on the purpose is to realize the purpose of God is for His glory, the redemptive purpose of God for lost humanity, and the redemptive purpose for the church to become more and more like Jesus. So Christ-likeness is the purpose of God, is the end goal of discipleship, that we become more and more conformed to the image of His Son. The purpose of God, the glory of God, the mandate of God. But there's a difference between the mandate, the purpose, and the mission. The mission answers the what question. And there are three things that in leadership I've learned, I hope to pass on. The first is to get mission clear. The second is to be mission ready. And the third is to stay mission true. To get mission clear, the church have called us, whether in the church or in the mission field, to make disciples of all nations. And that's why, to me, leadership succession is so important. Leadership development is so important. Leadership discipling is so important because it gets to the mission. Get mission clear, be mission ready. Not just ourselves as leaders or missionaries and pastors, but the people we lead, they must be mission ready. And then to stay mission true. If we are not mission clear, we are just going through the motion. If we are mission clear but not mission ready, we don't know how to fulfill the mission. If we are mission clear and mission ready, but we don't stay mission true, there is a mission drift. And after a while, we are no longer true to the mission. The mission of the church is to make disciples of all nations. And the clarity of it is something I hope to pass on to those who observe my leadership. That's why I give a huge amount of my time in mentoring, because mentoring helps me to be mission clear, mission true, mission ready. And by God's grace, to see that succession and to see that raising up of leaders through leadership development. One of the great leadership stumbling block is a lack of clarity. I really believe leadership is about clarity. That distinguishes the leaders from the non-leaders. The leader must be clear. If the leader is not clear, how can the followers have a very clear track to follow? But for the leaders to be clear, we need to ask the right questions. And this is, for me, one of my stumbling blocks. I need to retrain my mind, not just about goals and accomplishments and about systems and processes. The first thing as a leader I must learn is to ask the right questions. And there are 4 questions I've learned to ask. The 4 questions are: what for, what kind, what's possible, and what's next. What for is the question of purpose. Why are we doing what we are doing? What kind is a question of product. What are we producing? If we say we make disciples, then what kind of disciples are we producing? If we say we want to move towards spiritual maturity, then what kind of spiritual maturity are we talking about? What kind? The product. The third is what's possible. It is the promise of God. It is not about dreaming some grandiose dreams and say, oh, this is my dream, and after a while it's not fulfilled, we call it a nightmare. It's not that. It is the dream God ignites in our hearts by the promises of God, by the calling of God. In other words, it's not some other people's dreams or some other people's aspiration. It's what God has said to me, what God has said to you. What God has laid in our hearts of what's possible in Him by the very promises of God. I started the ministry God has given to me with a promise from God. Isaiah 60:22, the smallest shall become a clan, the least one a mighty nation. I, the Lord, will hasten it in its time. And at 2 a.m. in the morning, alone in the church in prayer, as I knelt before God, and this verse, Isaiah 60:22, came upon my heart. I know that the Hebrew word for clan is 1,000 strong. At that time, as the smallest church in the slowest growing denomination, 1,000 strong is unthinkable. but it was a promise of God. And so I simply receive what God has promised, get my heart aligned to what He has been leading, and be open to what He's called me to do. That's what's possible, the promises of God. And as I receive it personally, dream it, then my leadership flows out of it. And the fourth, what for, what kind, what's possible. The last is what's next. It is the process. When I'm clear about the purpose, what for? When I'm clear about the product, what kind? When I'm clear about the promise of God, what's possible? And I'm clear about the next step, the process. I am clear in my leadership. There's no stumbling block to it. Even if there were obstacles as in difficulties, once I'm clear in these 4 questions, I know how to deal with these difficulties. But when I don't know the next step, or I drift from the purpose, or I'm not very clear about the product I'm producing, or not sure about the promise of God, and I lose courage, I can't really lead as a leader. Leadership is about clarity and courage. The clarity to see and the courage to follow God's leading in what we see to bring about what God calls us to bring about. Yes, I've seen women in ministry empowered to fulfill their gifts and callings in God. Covenant EFC is designed for that. Now, theologically and biblically, I believe leadership is male. I cannot compromise on that. I cannot run around the scriptures, and that is my basic conviction, that there are, in the economy and the instruction of God, certain structures of authority. But in that male leadership, I realize that the male leadership is given of God to empower the leaders to arise, including the women folks. So, for example, in Covenant EFC, the chairman of the board is male, the senior pastor is male, but the role of the senior pastor is to empower the women leaders to rise up in ministry under the covering of male leadership. So if you ask me, is there models for it? Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it work. I'm very thankful that our women don't feel restricted in the way they lead. They preach in our pulpits under the covering of the senior pastor. They have pastoral leadership. We have women pastors. But I teach that while this is true and good, we must honor the leadership structure God has given. In the same way that the family can only function when the men recognize, the father and the husband recognize he is given of God, that spiritual authority to open that spiritual umbrella, as it were, to be a covering for his family. In the same way, the leadership that is male must do that. But in that covering, I have found the freedom and the empowering for women to minister in all the capacities. What are the principles involved? The first principle is to recognize that the gifting is not gender biased. The spiritual gift of God is for both male and female, slave and free, young and old. And therefore my role as senior pastor and now as leadership mentor is to encourage the church leaders to empower and to release those who are gifted to serve in their giftedness. Empower them. The second is to recognize the submission to spiritual authority. All of us are people under authority. When I'm a senior pastor and now as leadership mentor, I'm a man under authority. So when women leaders lead, when women leaders minister, they minister under the authority. But most importantly, we come as a team. In that team, we need that diversity. That is why I'm not ashamed or reticent to call women to have their input in leadership deliberations, because very often they see things beyond what we can see as male. We have our structures of thought that sometimes a different perspective is so helpful. It's the diversity of mindset being harmonized together in one aligned, focused perspective and compass. But in order to arrive at that focus alignment, I first need the diversity so that I am not trapped in a stubbornness of view without the wisdom of looking at it holistically. I call it theological holism, theological humility, spiritual holism, spiritual humility. The diversity of thought, and yet the humility to listen to one another and to submit to one another. I find this question very interesting. If I were to start my ministry all over again, what would I do differently? Interesting because this is the question I ask God. Up in the mountain, I keep a solitude time where I go up to the mountain to pray and to seek the Lord, an extended time of solitude. And it's that time of solitude that gives me a sense of clarity, a sense of compass. It is one of the foundations of spiritual life and spiritual growth for me. But in that solitude time, one of the questions I ask is, Lord, what would you like me to do differently? And then I learn, as I reflected in the presence of God, as I opened my life, to ask a question that is even more foundational than this question. And the question is, if I were to do my life and my ministry all over again, what would I do the same? Because there are many things I can tinker with. There are many things I wish I can do differently. But I must think through what are the things I will stay the same and do the same because it has the favor of God. For example, I will continue to seek God. I will continue to rely on both His calling and His strength. I will continue to seek a spiritual alignment to God, not my kingdom, but His kingdom. And in practical terms, I will continue to give myself to expository preaching, taking a book at a year, an Old Testament book a year, and to expound a New Testament book the other year. I will emphasize the prayer life of the church. I will emphasize mentoring and leadership development. These are the things I will still do. And when my mind is clear, what are the things I must still continue to do because it is led of the Lord, because it is favored of God. I see the favor of God pouring upon these things. If I start my ministry over again, I will continue to do these things. Not because it works or because it's the secret formula, but simply because these are the principles that the Lord has taught me, that have kept me true and steady in life and ministry. But what would I do differently? As I reflected upon this question, I realized the question is not what would I do more, because there are so many things I can do more. I want to pray more. I want to get into scriptures more. I want to share the gospel more. I want to mentor more. I want to do so many things more. But if I think of the question deeper, what would I do differently? What will be a game changer? What will be a paradigm shift? The first thing I will do, I will come out of my comfort zone in the leading of the church building project. I was a coward. I didn't realize that. I hide under the excuse that we are plurality of leaders, and in the plurality of the council of elders, we all come to pray and we decide on the building. Until in my quiet time one day, the Lord said, Edmund, you will never have a building unless you rise up in spiritual leadership and authority. So when I went to the board and said, we have always prayed and sought the Lord together for a building. In Singapore, you need to tender the price, a tender price for a land, 30 years lease. I said, this time we don't do it this way. This time I will pray and seek God. Your prayer is when I tell you the figure we should bid, your prayer is this the right figure? And you tell me together how you discern it. But I'm going up to the mountain to seek God. And I'm going to come down and tell you what He has put upon my heart as the spiritual leader of this church. And the board agreed to that. So I prayed, I came down with the amount. We prayed, we deliberated. And we agreed with the amount, and we got our first building, Bukit Panjang. And in the second building, it was the same, an exercise of spiritual leadership. The fundraising is done by our fundraising chairman and by our board, but the prayer, the seeking of the Lord's alignment and leading and the direction must come from the senior pastor. I wish I've learned that earlier. I will do it differently. I will have the courage to rise to lead. I have abdicated it for far too long. That's why for too long, we didn't have the facilities we have. We have the vision, We have the discipling, we have the Bible teaching, the Bible exposition, but the courage to lead like that, I didn't have. And that's one thing I'll change. The other thing I will change has to do with the same, of coming out of my comfort zone. In my own life and ministry, I will practice that, exercise that spiritual authority in spiritual warfare. I dare not talk about this, I dare not enter into this, because I'm an evangelical, son of an evangelical, non-charismatic, non-Pentecostal. It is outside my comfort zone. But today I understand more about spiritual authority, about spiritual warfare. There is a spiritual dimension to building the church. There's a spiritual dimension to global missions. It's not just a job. It's not just an occupation. It's a calling of God to engage in spiritual warfare. And there's no way we can engage in spiritual warfare but by the spiritual authority that is in Christ. And I dare not exercise that. I dare not learn about it. I dare not come. I just kept to Bible exposition, discipling, mentoring. And why? Because I dare not come out of my comfort zone. That's why. Today, if I start over again, what I would have done differently, I will marry the two closer, to be grounded in the Word and to be alive in the Spirit, so that we can build a church and disciple a church rooted in the Scriptures, mighty in the Spirit of God, empowered by Him. That's what I will do differently. I will mentor in this dimension, that dual engine, the Spirit and the Word, and be mighty in them.